Hello, everyone. Welcome to an all new episode of Equilibrium. I'm your host, Bria, and today I'm so excited to be with Alyssa Cole. She's a New York Times and USA Today best-selling author. How are you today, Alyssa?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being on the show. I am very excited, like I said, to have you here. I read your book when no one is watching and was like, I love this book. I was telling my husband all about it. And I was so excited when you just agreed to be on the show.
Well, thank you for asking me.
What are you reading or writing right now? Anything?
What what I'm reading right now is actually right here. This is my screen is not mirroring for some reason, but this is Her Good Side, written by my friend Rebecca Weatherspoon. It's her YA debut.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a really cute YA with about practice dating and prom dates and coming, finding your people. So that's what I'm reading right now. I'm biased a little bit because I'm Rebecca's friend, but I enjoyed her writing
Mm-hmm.
before I became her friend. So the bias, I think, is not is
Yeah,
not really there.
that sounds like a good one. Do you read a lot of like young adult novels?
I read a mix of things. Like right now, it kind of depends on my mood. I have a stack over here that has I'm like totally blanking on the name. Um Reggie and Delilah's Year of Falling by
Oh, I love that one.
why am I blanking on her name? She's so great. I have that. That's my next YA that I'm gonna read. I have Christina Forrest, adult debut book. And yeah, I read all different genres. So
Yeah.
and especially, now with more diversity in publishing, just trying to read and support all of the authors who are getting published now.
Yeah. Now you write a lot of romance and thriller novels, but you also write graphic novels as well. What about those genres interest you?
I'm basically interested in everything.
Mhm.
So I try to find the genre that fits for the idea that I have. Even within romance, like I write historical fiction, science fiction, fantasy, contemporary romance. That's kind of fantasy contemporary romance with the made up kingdoms, but it's like more rooted in reality, I guess. And I think with romance, with all of my books, no matter what I'm writing, I really enjoy thinking about human connection and how people, whether romantically or in their friendships or with their family, come together, work through issues, and kind of the human experience. And I feel like romance really allows you to explore that really deeply, in a way that in a different way from other genres. And then with thrillers, it's kind of similar. It's kind of situations of heightened emotion and how do people react in those situations. So I think that's kind of the appeal for me.
Yeah, I feel like if fear and love are kind of,
Yes.
you don't know how you're going to react to either of those states. So never,
Exactly.
never run out of stories with those two. I want to know about you. Tell me about your background.
My background is pretty normal. I was born in the Bronx and spent my childhood in the Bronx and Jersey City. Um, I went to, I didn't want to say their name before they started asking me for money, but I went to State University.
Mhm.
And I basically always wanted to be a writer. Or as a kid, I enjoyed telling stories. I enjoyed drawing stories as well. I thought maybe I was really into comics as a kid, and I thought maybe I would be a comic book artist or comic book writer, which is why being able to make a graphic novel is really fun. I'm making that with the illustrator, and my collaborator is Erin O'Neill Jones, who's an amazing artist and storyteller herself. So um, being able to do that now, it's kind of like really getting to live all of my childhood dreams, I guess.
Yeah. And
But
getting
writing,
recognized for it too.
yeah, and it's for me, it's just I don't know, it's kind of just something I always did, and then eventually I realized I could actually do it for a job. And like, luckily enough, even though that makes it hard in some ways, because when it's something that is kind of like a part of you, and then it becomes the way that you earn your money, and like all of the difficulties that come with any workplace or any job get attached to the thing that are like the thing you love.
Mhm.
It has its difficulties, but it's also, I feel extremely lucky to be able to do this for a job.
Yeah, I'm sure like I'm super impressed. I think it's great. And a lot of, people of color and writers of color don't really get the recognition, that they deserve. And there's so many writers out there and, people that aspire to be in your position. Can you talk a little bit about, how you got into the publishing industry and yeah, let's leave it there. How did you get into the publishing industry?
How I got into the publishing industry, basically, I wanted to be a writer for a while. I always, like I said, I've always been writing, usually like for myself or for school assignments or for things like that. And then I always was saying I was going to write a book, and it became like a joke with my friends, or like, oh, one day when you write a book, and like, which I find funny because it was like always a joke. And I'm like, but we were kind of manifesting.
Yeah, that's true. And now, yeah.
um but I really loved writing short stories, and it was always hard for me to kind of like keep working on a book for it to be fully book length. And I've always read all different genres, and as an adult I started reading romance more again. And I started being like, oh, maybe I can do this, and like maybe I can get a book published. But I still was having motivation issues. And I also started reading literatica.net. I don't even know if that exists anymore, probably. But it's kind of like it's like fanfiction.net or AO3 or one of those kind of sites, and I started reading it because there was a section where they had stories that featured like Black women and people of color. And while there were romance novels that existed, because we've always been writing romance novels, even if they weren't getting support, it was an accessible way to find like romantic stories and love stories, with people, that look like me and my friends. And I was started to see like the dedication of some of these people. I'm like, they're putting up a new chapter every week. And
Wow.
I was like, maybe, and they're doing this not for publication, like, just like fan fiction writers, they're doing it because they have a story to tell and they want to tell it. And I was like, I can't tell myself that this isn't like doable anymore. So I started putting up a story on Literotica. I got 3 chapters in, and then I lost my motivation. I also have ADHD. I didn't know this at the time.
Yeah.
And but then I found out, I started learning more about like romance writers, like as a group, thanks to Twitter, and like the website Smart Bitches Trashy Books. And I was like, oh, there are a lot of people who read romance novels. Okay. And then a lot of people who write them. And I like started going to events for romance writers at like my local bookstore in Brooklyn where I was living, Word Bookstore. And I learned about National Novel Writing Month. And I was like, oh, this is cool. Maybe this is what I can use to finally finish this book that I started, like on, the story that I started that I wanted to be a book. And so that was in 2010, I think. And through like I went to a National NaNoWriMo meetup, and I learned about the RWA NYC group, which was a group of romance writers. It was a chapter of RWA, and that were people who were writing toward publication. So all around that time, I did National Novel Writing Month. I finished the book, and the goal of National Novel Writing Month is usually every November, and I think every April is Camp NaNoWriMo, and it's basically you set a goal. It started as like a 50,000 word novel, and you try to finish it within a month. And then obviously you would have to go back and do like major editing and
Oh, wow.
revisions and stuff like that. But it worked well for me because um, just getting everything out and having a tight deadline works great for people with ADHD.
Yeah.
so, so I finished the first book, and then I wrote a novella, and then I joined a writing group, and I started writing more things and learning more about the publishing industry. And that book was published in 2014. It's not available for sale anymore, but it was called Eagle's Heart. It's a romantic suspense set in Brooklyn. And that it's like, I was like, I don't think I can put that back out. It had some like pretty heavy things going
Oh,
on,
I see.
with like an Albanian gang, the Albanian mafia, and
Wow.
trafficking and things like that. The story was good. I still
That's
stand by it,
amazing.
but
Yeah.
I was like, I think it's a little heavy. Even though I write heavy things, like I think for romance, it was more on the thriller side of romance, or heavier, darker romantic suspense, in the situations, not in the main characters. But anyway, that was published by Lucid, which was a digital press, and digital presses really started to open the gates for people of color and marginalized people writing stories and being able to get them published, when traditional publishers wouldn't publish them. And then I wrote a sci-fi series for my first like semi-traditional published book was my sci-fi, I call it cozy apocalyptic romance, um, the Off the Grid series, which was published by Karina, which was a digital publisher. Um, and yeah, then after that, my Loyal League series, and then after that, I kind of was just heading from one series to the next.
Yeah. And you talked a little bit about, finding that motivation where, a lot of creatives kind of, lose their motivation for lack of a better word. What is your writing process like, and what keeps you going and interested in, writing more series?
Um, well, my writing process is a mess. It changes. And before, when I first started, I was a pantser, meaning I really just wrote the story. I didn't necessarily have an outline. Like I basically knew how it started and how it ended and some of the stuff in between. And I still kind of am like that, but I tried to be more organized, and then that wasn't working out for me. So I'm like somewhere in between where I try to write out the scenes that I know and then kind of link from scene to scene.
Mhm.
Um, but my writing process, I write full time now. So interestingly enough, writing full time is still difficult for me. I know it's a privilege, but I don't have the same pressure of like writing before work, writing at lunchtime, writing after work, and like being like, okay, this is the only time I have to get this done. So my writing process has been like a series of like trying to figure out what is the most productive way for me to get my work done. Um, but and also just trying to figure out every productivity hack and then being like, okay, this doesn't work for me. But the main thing that actually works for me is co-working with other people
Really?
via Zoom, or I live on an island. I mean, there are co-working spaces, but not next to where I live. So
Mhm, mhm.
I usually do it via Zoom, like with friends, or sometimes I do it with like various online groups that are having co-working spaces for people, and that helps me to focus and get my work done too.
Do you like share ideas with each other in the spaces, or
um,
it's just, having bodies near you?
it's usually just like seeing someone else working. Sometimes people say what they're working on. If it's like one of my friends, they'll say, we'll talk a little bit, and then we'll be like, okay, we have to
Wow.
work now.
So your characters, and your books feature very diverse love stories. Why is that important to you?
I honestly wouldn't say it's important to me. It's mostly just kind of a reflection. I know that sounds bad. It's a reflection of like I grew up in a very diverse area, first in the Bronx and then in Jersey City, just growing up around all kinds of people. And one of the things that bothered me when I was a kid was reading books. I loved reading and being like, none of these characters, or like 99% of these characters, do not look like me, my family, my parents, or any of my friends from all of the, myriad places that they came from. Unless it was like some sad story or like some stereotype in the background. So when I started writing, I wanted to kind of write, um, I think I usually, when like, diversity is the word that we use, but I think it's realistic. I think that I write realistically, and just try and reflect the world as I know it. And because when I see books that are like all white people, that's not realistic to me. So,
Mhm.
I mean, I know it's realistic some places, but usually the settings that they're in, it's not realistic.
Right, right.
Um, so yeah, so basically I just tried to write what I wanted to read when I was younger, and stories that reflect, you know, the people that I grew up with, or even just like make sure that there is representation for all different kinds of groups.
Yeah. And, obviously, when no one is watching, one of my favorites, the main character, she was so relatable. And I find, are you drawing a lot of that inspiration from your own friends?
I wouldn't say from my friends. I feel like a lot of my characters are just like various, they're not me, but I don't know how to describe it. Like some people say that they like the characters come to them and they talk to them, and I don't have that experience. I feel like characters in my books, whether they're the female protagonist or the male protagonist, or um, all have various aspects of things that I've thought about or that I've experienced or that I'm interested in, and then it kind of manifests into these characters. So, I mean, I'm sure just by the, virtue of being around people like that does like, but I don't think like when I look at my characters, I think more so, um, and sometimes I don't realize it. Like even like Sydney, one of the funniest things to me in When No One Is Watching is there's a line that I read after it was published, and I had to like do the readings for the books and stuff. And it was like basically making people learn about history that makes them uncomfortable is fun. And I was like, oh, okay. That's so some aspects of the characters, mostly they're their own thing, but some aspects of myself leak in there, I guess.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned, the history and making people uncomfortable with it. I didn't know a lot of that about Brooklyn, and how those neighborhoods came together, which is on me. I need to look that up more. But were you surprised by anything when you were doing, your research or just, learning about Brooklyn on your own time?
So a lot of the things that I had learned, I've written like several historical romances, some of them set in New York and some of them generally, in the US, in the Eastern US and the Northeastern US. So like in the South as well, but just a lot of the things I've learned over the year, I still get surprised all the time. Like I know there are some people who are like, "Why does that surprise you?" But I'm like, because people being evil surprises me. Like I hope I'm
Oh,
never jaded. I hope I'm never jaded enough that I'm not surprised, even if I'm like, okay, yeah, that I could see them doing that. But so a lot of the history was surprising and interesting to me, even though I already knew so much other stuff from a lot of my historical research before. And this book for me was like, I didn't realize while I was writing it, but a kind of catharsis of like all of the anger I felt while learning that history, while researching all of these other books. But some of the interesting stuff, like there were things about like, the tunnels under the ground and stuff like that, that was interesting to me. And also like some of the stuff about like, there were like these Jehovah's Witness buildings along the waterfront that kind of, I was reading about like how the architecture and underground tunnels and like cages and stuff that were in there. So it's like, all of this is like kind of interesting, and can work its way into the book. And then also, of course, the Black America, which I feel like I had come across in my research at some point, and I was like, okay, I need to like jettison this out of my brain to for for a while. And
Mhm.
then I came across an article about it again while I was researching Brooklyn specific history for this book, and I was like, okay, um, that's going in there. So just kind of wanted to add all of these things and just for me, because kind of what you said, like you didn't know these things about Brooklyn and that's on you. And I don't think it's on you. I think that a lot of these things are not taught. Um, and most of these things are not taught. And also the resources to be able to learn about them have only recently become available to most people. Like not having to go to the library and be an academic or be doing a dissertation or something on it. So
Mhm.
I think that for me, um, using my books, like I'm interested in history and I'm interested in finding out these things, these stories that are not well known, or these aspects of history that are not well known, and then kind of integrating them into stories that are entertaining, um, and could be entertaining and on their own, but kind of also using them as vehicles for this history that most of us don't know about.
Yeah, and I find that a lot of times they don't want us to know
Yeah.
the history. So, um, I want to talk a little bit about the publishing industry and just, being a writer of color and, any challenges that you faced, while trying to get any of your books published and knowing what your thoughts are on shining a light on writers of color and how the publishing industry can do better with that.
So the publishing industry, I feel like, is a machine, and it can chew up and spit out anyone. But particularly, authors of color, people or people from other marginalized backgrounds, are way more likely to be getting chewed up in the back of the
Mhm.
mouth there. So it's like it's a difficult industry. It's difficult to get into, and it can be very discouraging. Um, and so I do think they can do, but I think they can do better by most authors. And then then you add on systemic racism or even like unexamined biases. Because I was very involved in like kind of fighting for diversity in publishing even before I got published, like when I first started trying to get published, and I was like, what's going on here? This doesn't make any sense. There would be all kinds of data about like, oh, well, those people don't buy books. And I was like, who are you asking? Are you marketing to them? Like, why do you just, how can you just like put a fact like that out there and accept it as a reality unless you actually believe this? And then you think about, again, this is why history is important. Um, what, like, you think about the history of Black bookstores and how they were targeted by the FBI, by the CIA, and by COINTELPRO and programs like that to shut them down, and about how there had to be literal laws against Black people learning to read. And then you get to 2015 and you have publishers saying, well, those people don't read. And it's like, is that true?
Mhm.
Is that really true? Or is that just an unexamined bias you have that you are backing up with data collected from who knows what source, but probably not a source that is actually talking to many Black people or people of color? Um, so things like that, like I think one of the main issues with diversity in publishing is sometimes I feel like right now they probably feel a bit of a mission accomplished because more authors of color are being published. And it's like the goal is not to have a diversity quota. The goal is for you to stop seeing books by authors of color as a like project that you're doing, or like something separate from a normal book. um so I think things are changing, but slowly, but I do think it's still very difficult for people to navigate. And it can be like just difficult for authors of color because on top of the regular writing and how hard that is, then there's navigating um knowing whether you're being paid what your colleagues are being paid, um, navigating the kind of extra additional pressure of having to be like a diversity representative, you know, like uh things like that. And then, you know, I know for me and for other people, when I was first starting out, there was also this pressure of like, my book has to be, it better be good,
Yeah.
because I'm not giving them any excuse to say, well, this book by this Black person didn't do well, so now we're gonna, you know,
Yeah. No one
maybe we
else
should.
needs. Yeah.
Exactly. And I feel like that's a pressure that you know, white people from non-marginalized groups don't have to think about. If my book doesn't do well, is the publisher going to use me as an excuse not to support someone else? So I think there are things like that that are like additional pressures, um, that hopefully other people don't have to feel as much right now, and hopefully in the future it won't be something that even crosses someone's mind.
Hope not. I hope not. Maybe probably a few years off, but we're getting there. We're working on it. I want to talk about, what it feels like for you to be a New York Times bestselling author. What is that like for you?
um, Honestly, I still haven't really.
You're like, it's a normal day.
I like it's I have like my little plaque hanging there that the publisher sent me, and I'm like, I look at it sometimes and I'm like, oh, that's wild that that happened, but like it still doesn't feel like it happened to me. I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm like, one day, sometimes things take a while to sink in. I'm like, wait, one day I'll be sitting here like, oh my God. I mean, like, I'm excited about it, I'm proud of it, but it also still doesn't quite feel real.
hmm Makes sense. Makes sense. I am proud of you, and I love that book. And I
Thank you.
definitely, I'm so glad I found it. I forgot how I even found it, but after loving that one, I want to read all of your books now.
Thank
Um,
you.
Tell me what's next for you.
Next for me, I am working on my next thriller. I'm wrapping it up. It's a bit late, you know, pandemic, pandemic kind of messed everybody up. Um, but the next thriller is called One of Us Knows, and it's probably the most difficult book I've written to date, just technically. Um, the main protagonists are part of a dissociative identity disorder system, and basically, one of them has been dormant for 6 years. She slept through Trump and the pandemic, the beginning of the pandemic and everything.
So
And she
lucky.
wakes and she wakes and she's like the asshole of the group, which is why she was dormant. She was like, fine, I'll just, guys don't want me around, then I'll leave.
Mhm.
And basically, a fairy is approaching her. She realized she's being taken to a job as the caretaker of a home on an island in the Hudson. And as they're approaching it, she sees that it looks exactly like, it's a castle that looks exactly like the castle that is their inner world home for the dissociative identity disorder system. So it's basically figuring out, what are they doing there? Um, there's really not a paper trail for how they got a job, which is very uncharacteristic for the person who got them the job. And why does it look like their inner world? What does it have to do with that part of their childhood that they can't remember? And also, why are they there now? Because weird things are starting to happen.
Oh God.
So it's kind of like a gothic thriller with horror elements, because there's a ghost. It's an old castle. There's
Yeah.
a ghost in the mix too. So yeah, I'm excited for this one. I hope people will like it. And it's, for me, it just has been interesting trying to, deal with all of the different characters and all of the interweaving plot lines and stuff like that. So that
Wow.
is the next one for me.
It sounds good. And it's funny because I don't typically read thrillers, but now I'm all into them. Like now I'm like, what have I been doing with my time? Like they're just so like page turning. I'm like,
Yes,
what happens next? Yeah, I love it. I will be looking for your next one.
thank
And
you.
I appreciate you being on the show. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we will, definitely stay in contact. I want to keep up with you and support you, and make sure my audience does too. And thank you, Alyssa.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time, everyone. Thank you.